nerve cells do not regenerate.
Yes, that's a myth, of course. Yes, of course.
Half your head is gone, everything's hockey, but it's not okay.
Brutal, just brutal.
Why doesn't brain size affect intelligence?
The brain doesn't want anything.
Is it possible to control the brain?
You need to have a snack.
Dear friends, hello, we're with you again, and today my comrade is with me. We were even doctor and patient in the past, and now we're just colleagues. Candidate of Philosophical Sciences, Associate Professor at the Center for Consciousness Studies of the Faculty of Philosophy at Moscow State University, Anton Kuznetsov. I have a lot of questions for you, questions that are bothering my smart, well-read, enlightened audience, and I really like the way you answer questions because it's incredibly interesting. And podcasts like these, where I myself, to put it mildly, don't really understand the topic, aren't particularly interesting for me to host because I learn something new for myself. Let's start with the first question. I see that you're drinking coffee, so answer this simple question for us. Coffee, sugar, energy drinks during training in relation to the brain, how does all of that work?
It works in such a way that it's just very fast energy. The brain is basically a monstrous energy vacuum, so it's actually better for the body not to think. In general, it's better not to think, because that way you'll use less energy. That way you need fewer resources, eat less, and so on. But especially if you're engaged in scientific work or just think a lot, the amount of energy required is monstrously large. It's necessary, and through sugar-containing things like pastries or something like that, it's simply a quick source of energy that gets used up. And here, of course, there's the point that if you have a sedentary lifestyle and you don't think much, then probably you shouldn't eat pastries. But if you actually have intense cognitive activity, then it's just necessary, and the same goes for coffee. Well, that's how coffee really is. It doesn't actually stimulate any mental activity, right? It just puts you in an excited state, like any energy drink. And let's say you haven't slept or something like that. You drink Red Bull, you drink coffee, you feel bloated, you feel wired. Yeah, but at the same time, your thoughts are confused and everything else, because there's still some underlying stress, there's no recovery, and overall it doesn't help at all. And especially considering that coffee has the opposite effect, right? I mean, it works for about 20 minutes, maybe a bit more, and then you want to sleep. That's usually the crash. That's why, for example, truck drivers, there's often a story where truck drivers drink coffee, fall asleep, and then there's an accident. So if you're driving, say you have a long road ahead and decide to drink some coffee, the likelihood that you'll fall asleep at the wheel actually increases. Even though
there's also an icon, I won't mention the brand, that actually shows you a little coffee cup.
Well, it's the same story as when you can see photos, I think, from the 70s at the Tour de France, where cyclists are lighting cigarettes for each other. Well, they're literally smoking cigarettes, because it was believed that if you smoked a cigarette, it would somehow stimulate you and you'd be ready to pedal better. And so that was just a misconception, or for example, adding cognac to it. Well, if someone did cross-country skiing or something like that, they'd give you something with cognac so that at the end, at the finish, you could push through the last kilometers. But nobody does that anymore.
Interesting. A weight loss method, you eat a pastry, then go solve a crossword puzzle.
Well, a crossword puzzle isn't really a cognitive activity, not a demanding one,
So what's demanding?
Demanding cognitive activity. That's when your head literally hurts from thinking. I mean, that's when you... First of all, it's an activity that's unusual for you, cognitive or familiar, but where the level of the task, the level of its novelty, is very challenging. What you need, first of all, is cross-domain effort, meaning different domains of knowledge, let's say. So to solve a certain task, you have to unexpectedly intertwine different areas of action and knowledge. And that's when it becomes, really very...
Listen, and during exams, they say, eat some chocolate. Does chocolate really help open up new pathways?
No, it's just very strong stress. And often students during exams, well, I know this myself since I teach at the university, Students get very stressed before exams, sleep very little, and forget to eat. And sometimes it happens that the blood sugar level drops so much that fainting occurs. So actually, from a practical point of view, it's just to prevent fainting.
Nerve cells don't regenerate is a common phrase we often hear. So, do they regenerate or not?
Yes, of course, nerve cells do regenerate. There are processes of neurogenesis and cell migration. This is very important because even though we have an abundance of nerve cells, especially in childhood, so many that you can't even compare it to an adult. Yes, well, first of all, this surplus goes away very quickly, and secondly, nerve cells are constantly dying. Right now, as we're talking, the process of nerve cell death is happening. And processes like neurogenesis, of course, allow us to maintain our brain metabolic processes and so on at a certain, let's say, permanent, constant level. That's why neurogenesis exists, and it can be stimulated by cognitive training as well as by any kind of activity, any unusual activity. For example, some neurosurgeons or even ordinary people might deliberately eat only with their left hand if they're right-handed, or like me, I brush my teeth with the other hand on purpose. Yes, 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 yes. So whenever you engage in any process that involves elements of learning, no matter what kind, in fact, it promotes neurogenesis.
That's why, when it comes to Alzheimer's disease, they say you should learn languages or play a new musical instrument.
Well, that's more of a stereotype, really, a stereotype. Unfortunately, Alzheimer's disease is like a train that can't be stopped. That is, it's a programmed thing, like programmed apoptosis, meaning neurodegeneration, the death of cells, in this case in the hippocampus. And unfortunately here, first of all, there are no ways to prevent it once it has already started. If you've lived to this point, because many people simply don't live long enough to get Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, but with enough lifespan, it's 100%.
If we all lived to be 200 years old, everyone would have Alzheimer's.
Yes, yes, just like cancer. I mean, just like cancer. That is, people who didn't get cancer just didn't live long enough, right? People who didn't have it. And in this case, cognitive training for Alzheimer's, well, of course it's important, but it's important. How can I put it? Well, actually, it's your whole life, like you have a problem and you decide, oh, I'll start doing sports. Well, actually, you should do sports your whole life, yeah, or something like that. And by the way, sports, in terms of some basic prevention, it's actually much more effective because very often neurodegeneration, yeah, it can be triggered simply by poor blood circulation. And if you have a really sedentary lifestyle, yeah, constantly, then in general, the likelihood that it will start earlier, well, increases. If it's meant to start, it will start.
Well, for example, I tried to get my grandmother to memorize poems for a while so that she would have, like you said, neuroplasticity, yeah, so that her brain would work in that direction.
Yeah, that's true. The memorization is exactly that kind of cognitive training, specifically of an educational nature. So once again, if it's just with crosswords, yeah, that doesn't work. It's exactly what causes you a certain kind of struggle. Yeah, where, especially. As people get older, they stop memorizing things, not because they're just worse at it, but maybe they get lazy or they think, why should I memorize this, or something like that. Yeah, although memorization is, of course, always very effective.
Children, for example, their learning speed is higher than that of adults. Often, this is connected to the fact that they have more nerve cells.
First of all, yes, there are a lot of nerve cells, and this leads to increased neuroplasticity. In this case, neuroplasticity is the ability to form new connections. And in the case of some unpleasant things like brain damage, yes, it helps to compensate for certain deficits. That's why, for example, certain brain surgeries are only performed during childhood. Yes, for example, something like a hemispherectomy, an adult wouldn't be able to handle it. No, I mean when a hemisphere is removed, yes, that's what I mean.
But what about those cases where they show a failed suicide attempt or some kind of injury? Half the head is gone, but the person is still alive, seems to be talking and everything.
Well, I mean,
He lived with half a brain.
well, there are cases when even a crowbar went through someone's head, yes, but still, if there's a severe injury, actually, there are always changes, always. So these videos,
That we watch, where half the head is missing, but everything seems okay.
no, you just need to find out what's going on there. That's what I mean. The thing is, every case is unique, so you can't use the same standard for everyone. Is there such a problem here? Especially in brain research and in our cognitive functioning as well, when some very interesting cases or very interesting lesions are discovered, they are usually very rare, and we can't draw conclusions. There's not enough data or statistics for the whole population. And on top of that, sometimes the features of the brain, even our operators for all people, they're very large, really very large. And this makes it very difficult to draw any conclusions.
You know, there's a saying that men are from Mars, women are from Venus. I think that's how it goes. And anatomically, our brains don't seem to be different, but in terms of function, the male brain is different from the female brain.
As you can understand, this is a rather slippery area.
Go ahead.
How to have your own opinion, but not just at the level of your own opinion. You know what I mean? It's very simple. If there are systematic differences between men and women, if there are systematic differences, these differences have to be reflected in the nervous system. They just have to be. That is, the way I move my head like this or do something similar is related to the nervous system. If there are systematic differences in male and female nature, like behavior in general or something else, or body structure, these differences are also present in the nervous system. That is, it's impossible for it to be otherwise. And here you see people immediately start speculating on this topic, trying to get something out of it. It's clear that there are men who are more feminine, there are women who are more feminine, masculine, and so on. But on average, let's say, if we're talking about some emotional things, the peculiarities of how the limbic system works or something like that, there are some differences here. Here, as you understand, these differences can be erased. For example, hormonally, a man can change quite a lot, like, I don't know, have much fewer male hormones, more of others, and his sensitivity will also increase. Well, in general, there are differences, but here we need to be very careful, very careful.
Tell me, how does alcohol affect our brain in the context of short-term use? Let's say today you and I took and drank, for example, a bottle of vodka between the two of us. What is happening to our brain right now, and in general, what happens to the brain when you drink constantly? How?
Well, look, I won't go into molecular processes here, and besides, I'm not competent to explain that. But let's put it this way. Alcohol servings are divided into 3 types. There's a small dose, a medium one, and a large one. Small doses of alcohol. Let's say you and I had a glass of wine each, something like that. Again, it's individual for everyone.
The boy suggested lying. Some people drink.
They have an antidepressant effect. That's 100%. That is, if we're talking about a small dose, then the person just becomes more relaxed, something like that. If the dose increases, then the antidepressant effect goes away and signs of cerebellar ataxia begin. Basically, the person starts moving worse and their speech articulation gets worse too, something like that. And when a person drinks a lot, it's a very strong intoxication, of course. And with prolonged use, alcoholism develops. For example, there's this thing called hair of the dog, right? Only alcoholics do that. Yeah, it's not a polite expression. It's more like a saying. When you feel bad, people say, have a hair of the dog. But it only works for alcoholics. Well, sorry, please. You shouldn't speak so badly about an alcoholic, sorry.
To a healthy person.
He'll feel even worse. Of course, because the thing is, while you're sleeping, the byproducts of alcohol breakdown are actively released, and they are the main toxins. And when alcohol dependence develops, the brain starts, well, to put it simply, working on alcohol. That means literally a person like that won't be able to get going. It's really like that. He won't be able to get started if he doesn't drink in the morning.
So those caricature images when there's a little, not a wine glass, but like cowboys often had, a small amount of alcohol in the inside pocket.
Yeah, he goes, but it's not just a little. The thing is, alcohol addiction is set up in such a way that it always progresses.
Addictions are the same for women and men, alcohol.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, you see, the process is the same, but the meaning is the same too. If alcohol addiction starts, it means that the brain, in its activity, not just the brain, reorients itself toward alcohol. Yes, it literally can't function without it. That's withdrawal. It's literally withdrawal. It's not that someone is a bad person or that you're just drinking. It's just impossible otherwise. It simply won't work. And it's very hard. It happens a lot. This leads to dystrophy because the more you start drinking alcohol and the stronger it gets, the less you eat, and so on. So in the end, it's all very, very sad.
We are all used to thinking of sleep as a period of time when, like a computer, we are turned off, our consciousness is off, and everything works at minimal capacity, meaning the mechanism is barely being cooled down. Last time we talked, you said that during sleep, activity doesn't actually decrease at all. So could you please explain what really happens? First of all, what is sleep in simple terms for us? What happens to the brain and what is the level of activity when we sleep?
Again, it's a very debatable topic related to sleep. First of all, during sleep, naturally, our cortex, which is responsible for cognitive functions, is literally asleep. If you look at an fMRI, there won't be much activity there. It's asleep, so to speak. The thalamus is kind of like, well, I don't know, a transformer booth, let's call it that, to put it simply. So, why do we need sleep? Well, there are a lot of speculations here because many biological species don't sleep at all.
For example,
well, some insects, for instance, they don't have sleep like we do. Daily sleep, they just don't have it. It's simply not there. Or some animals like bears or others can spend several months in hibernation. You see, that's also a thing. And even now, sometimes there still isn't a clear answer to the question of why we need sleep, especially since we could be eaten while we're asleep. There are the following hypotheses. First, that some kind of internal repair of the system takes place. Yes, because during wakefulness, too much energy is spent on handling peripheral tasks. Yes, and that's why good sleep is simply necessary for the proper functioning of internal organs and everything else. The second point is information binding. We have processes like memory consolidation, which is when short-term memory turns into long-term memory, and sleep, short-term sleep, is important for memory consolidation. Because during sleep there are even recommendations that if you read something or do something similar before going to bed, you'll remember it better. And like they used to say in school, put the book under your pillow. Of course, that's an extreme, but that's how it is. And for the health of the brain as well as the whole body, sleep is extremely important. If a person doesn't get enough sleep, it leads to neurological problems.
I can tell you that regularly missing 2 to 3 hours of sleep a day lowers your sex hormone levels by 10 to 15 years. So, if you're not getting enough sleep at 35, your testosterone level will be like it would be at 45 or 47. That's why when it happens, you should set a routine first.
In a neurological sense as well, because there are problems, look, in quotes, the best problems are the ones that can be solved surgically. But that doesn't mean it's cool or good, especially when it comes to the brain. Yes, but what I mean is that it's clear what can be done. But neurological problems are basically the kind of problems that can't be cured, meaning they respond very poorly to treatment, like chronic pain or something like that. And lack of sleep can provoke this, but most importantly, it's the quality of sleep that matters. That is, you can lie in bed for 8-10 hours, but if you're constantly waking up and so on, that's not very good.
Anton Viktorovich, a question for you. I've had sleep paralysis a couple of times in my life, so I studied this topic. I was curious. You wake up, guys, for those who don't know, who hasn't had it. It's a fairly common phenomenon in life. Usually everyone experiences it at least once or twice. You wake up, you're no longer asleep, but you can't move. And for some reason during this period you can also see all sorts of hallucinations. I had this happen to me twice. I thought maybe I was losing my mind, but then I read about it. This was, I think, when I was still in college, and realized that yes, it really does happen. But the fear you feel at that moment, especially if you don't know about it and have never read anything about it, is intense. Tell me, is there any scientific explanation for why this happens?
Yeah, it's really scary. I mean, you wake up and you can feel, speaking from my own experience, as if someone is standing behind you, pressing down on your ear or just looming over you, and you're afraid to turn around. What's going on here? So the feeling is very unpleasant. And here I was talking about the thalamus, like a kind of transformer box. There's the thalamocortical connection, right? It's very important. And in the case of sleep paralysis, the cortex wakes up, meaning cognitive functioning is active, but the motor commands that go through the thalamus don't get through because the thalamus is still resting, and this causes sleep paralysis. When you've already woken up cognitively, but everything else hasn't woken up yet, and by the way, the opposite situation can also happen, that's somnambulism or sleepwalking, which is when the cortex hasn't woken up, but the thalamus is like, woohoo, let's have a party.
Tell me, and it's dangerous to wake up sleepwalkers.
The problem is that it's very hard to do.
Even if I shake him, he doesn't wake up.
No, especially I think that the part of our audience who have sleepwalkers in their family, they know that this is a big problem. Well, naturally, some strong impact, yes, it can lead to the person waking up, but to wake them up on purpose like that, if there's no danger, well, it's not worth it.
You told me a very interesting story about the sleepwalker killer.
Yes, that's the case of Kenneth Parks, which happened a long time ago and ended very sadly. Because this Kenneth Parks, he wasn't some kind of villain, psychopath, or any other antisocial type. The story goes that he fell asleep in front of the television, then woke up in quotes. And all this description of the story is important to understand how unbelievable it seems. That he got up, left the house, got into the car while still basically asleep, yes. He drove about 17 miles, not through fields, but on regular roads. Yes, well, apparently there were no police reports. I don't know if he broke any laws or not. Because there aren't as many police on the roads in the United States and Canada as we have here. That's where it happened. Yes, it was in Canada. Yes. He went to his godparents' house and did what he did. He killed his godmother, strangled his godfather, but the godfather survived. I know, I'm pretty sure that many of your viewers are people who practice martial arts. And they know that with strangulation, yes, you can lose consciousness, you can pass out, but not necessarily. But that doesn't mean it's instant death. And apparently that's what saved this person, that he lost consciousness and somehow he was just released. The daughter of these people, she escaped from Parks by locking herself behind a door. Then he leaves the house and after some time discovers that his hands are covered in blood. He goes to the police and this was documented. He says something like the following: I think I did something terrible. I think I killed someone. Those are roughly the words he says. And then there was a long investigation, as a result of which Parks was acquitted. It was recognized that he was not conscious, but Parks himself after the verdict. Well, not immediately, of course, but he ended his life by suicide. He couldn't live with it. Now, I think many people will get excited about the idea that, well, maybe Parks fooled everyone and that he was actually conscious. There were a lot of tests. One of the most striking episodes was that Parks had his hands covered in deep cuts, very deep cuts. This happened because when he was handling the knife, he was holding it by the blade, and he was a sleepwalker, which was the trend.
He was sleepwalking with the knife, holding it in his fist.
Yes. Well, or at some point, I mean, of course, nobody was there to witness it.
He didn't wake up from this, it turns out.
No, he didn't wake up. So the level of blockage is very, very, very strong.
That's what's happening. So he was holding some kind of grudge against these people in his subconscious.
No. That's the point. If he had some kind of grudge or motive, it would have made it much harder to deliver a not guilty verdict. In this case, there were no motives. That is, his relationship with his godparents was better than with his own parents, and they called him a tall guy, a kind giant, something like that. Parks himself was a very good-natured person, although he had problems with gambling addiction, but overall he had no motive. That is, he didn't have any incidents related to things like, I hate these people, or anything like that.
The first step to health is to clearly understand what condition you are in right now, whether you have any problems that you don't know about yet. We're all used to getting tests done only when a problem has already made itself known, and there are problems that are already hard to solve by then. That's why it's very important to go through checkups on time, regularly, and as planned. This will allow you to prevent some diseases or treat them at an early stage of development. I'm very proud to introduce to you the BioCheck service. All the information about the BioCheck service is available at the link below this video. Go there, find your city, and get your checkup.
Tell me,
does freedom of choice exist? For example, I offered you tea or coffee and you chose. But did you really make that choice, or did you just voice it?
I'll say this. First, the space for freedom is much smaller than it seems, but it does exist. Because often when you hear from some neurobiologist, evolutionary biologist, or just a science journalist like Sam Harris, the claim that you have no free will, these statements are actually beyond the facts as you know them. Well, let's say someone says that for there to be free will, your decision must be undetermined, meaning that literally in the world there must be. You see, indeterminism is a very complicated thing. It means that, for example, there are future events. And if indeterminism is true, then the world can branch out like a garden of forking paths. That is, the future can go to the right, to the left, or anywhere. And if it's determinism, then the future is like a highway. There are no deviations to the right or left. And the truth is, we are not really able to know this. Well, unfortunately, as finite cognitive beings, we don't know whether indeterminism is true or not. And believe me, quantum mechanics has nothing to do with it at all. But at the same time, people who criticize free will say it's something that's connected to these kinds of things, but we don't know anything about it. We know something else, that people make decisions 100%, that freedom can be, let's say, trained. In this case, that's what we mean by freedom. I understand it as something tangible, normal. It's the ability to control yourself and to pursue some long-term goals. Let's say right now, well, we all know it's a complicated situation, a very complicated political situation. And let's say you, for example, you have political expertise, you know some political theories, you're well aware of the political process, and a lot of other things as well. Yes, or let's say you're just a person who lives in some kind of information space, and whatever comes your way, you just go along with it like a puppet, that's it. Accordingly, the higher your political expertise, the more opportunities you have, the more room you have to act in the political space. And this applies to everything. That is, freedom is not absolute. Freedom is something we gain thanks to our own essence, our own willpower. The more responsibility you take on and the less you avoid responsibility for your own fate, the greater your space of freedom becomes. It doesn't just fall from the tree like a banana. Can you tell us about some interesting experiments or studies on the brain? Well, I'll say right away that they're quite limited now, and even what they could do in Pavlov's laboratories. Yes, it's a well-known story that the Nobel Committee simply approached Pavlov and said maybe we shouldn't do things like that. But in reality, they did whatever they wanted both after Pavlov and up until the 1960s. Take lobotomy, for example, or punitive psychiatry like that, and it was considered normal. What should we do? Well, let's give him a lobotomy, or let's just shock them with electricity. Yes, this kind of shock therapy was considered completely normal, and even the doctors themselves treated it like, well, yes, that's just the job. And at the same time, well, somewhere. In the United States, more than 1.5 million people underwent this lobotomy operation. That is, when the frontal centers, which are responsible for willpower, motivation, and everything else, were destroyed, a person essentially turned into a kind of vegetable. Well, other experiments, yes, many of them were related to what was done with animals. For example, when centers of rage were removed, or on the contrary, stimulated, or something else. Here's one of the most unexpected examples. This so-called blind sight was discovered completely by accident because the monkey, her name was Helen. They destroyed the visual cortex V1. Well, that's how it was. You could do that back then. Nowadays, it's difficult to get permission to destroy anything, but they destroyed this visual cortex. It is responsible for the primary processing of visual information. So if it is destroyed, that's it. All the other visual centers of the cortex receive nothing. And that's blindness, meaning you can't see anything. It's complete darkness. Yes, yes, yes. But it turned out completely by accident, though I won't tell the whole story. A wonderful story, but it turned out that somehow she could see, and that was impossible. When Weisskranz, the great neurobiologist of the 20th century, learned about these results from his graduate student, he wrote that maybe it's time to start drinking. But then it was confirmed, and unfortunately people with such lesions appeared, and it became clear that there is an alternative way in which we can look at the world. So this is the so-called third eye. Well, not that it really is a third eye. And if they really could guess something there, they would have to destroy all visual images. V1 and go to Las Vegas and win some jackpots there. It's not exactly a third eye, it's just a shorter visual tract, which also goes to the superior colliculus of the brainstem. But not only that, and it's responsible for things like, for example, there. Well, again, continuing with the topic of martial arts, yes, dodging a punch, well, you won't have time to do it consciously. So, this path, if the camera is looking at me like this, yes, if I turn from my eyes to the back of my head, and then there's the temporal parietal occipital junction. I mean, that's a lot. That's a lot, right? How can you live in a single moment if everything is stretched out like that? We need some kind of acceleration. I mean, we need to do it faster, to dodge a blow faster. Well, if you're boxing or something like that. And also, actually, most of the functions that seem conscious to us are performed blindly. That is, without the involvement of consciousness. By the way, there's an interesting point about maturation here, since we've touched on the simultaneity of our existence. It's related to the fact that in many ways, our brain is not just a receiver of information, meaning it doesn't just perceive information from inside or outside and react to it somehow. Survival isn't possible that way. The brain and our psyche as a whole is a predictive machine. It lives a little bit ahead, a little bit in the future. Because if there are no predictions about what will happen in the next moment, even for a split second, then simultaneity is impossible. Our conversation right now would be impossible if our cognitive system didn't predict what would happen in the next moment.
Look, there's a service like that. Dog cloning, by the way, it costs $50,000. They take a piece of tissue, and it doesn't even have to be from a living dog. In 8 to 12 weeks, they give you a puppy. Sometimes even earlier, they just don't separate it from the mother right away. So here's the question. When we clone a dog and it grows up, will it behave the same way? Will it have the same psychological type? Because twins are still two different organisms. But here, we're raising a copy. Why am I asking this? I'm asking because I'm curious whether we're born with some kind of program at the genetic level, or if it's like rolling the dice every time, and whatever grows up, that's what you get. Because I remember my little one, the way she was, with her personality traits, when she was that small, and when she grew up, she stayed the same. Basically just a bigger copy. And I'm curious, if we clone a dog, for example, not that I plan to, but if we clone it, will it be an exact copy? Or is this program not a genetic given? Or does something unique appear every time?
That's a very complicated question, and we need to separate things here. Let me start with an example. I think maybe someone has noticed this. It's an amazing piece of news. So, an American official said that, generally speaking, obesity is a genetic thing. A lot of people were outraged, saying that proper nutrition, eating right or not eating right, is useless. One of the main arguments against this view of the nature of obesity was related to a study on twins, where it's literally clear that in childhood the differences are minimal, yes, in character and everything else, but let's take the age of 35 years. What I saw was a very large girl sitting with a very small, slim girl. They are twins and they have different personalities. Everything is different. So, in general, despite the fact that genetics really determines a lot, it really does determine a lot. But nevertheless, the environment, especially the human environment, in the case of animals, there isn't such a social environment as we have, but in the case of humans, the environment has a pretty strong influence on character. And let's say, again, the same dog, right? Well, I apologize for such a cruel example, but what happens if there are such monsters, who beat animals. What will happen to an animal if it's constantly beaten?
It will probably become aggressive.
For the fight, right? I mean, will it be the same caring creature in its character as someone knew it before or not? So you have to look at it. Naturally, nothing is guaranteed. Genetics only shows itself 100% depending on the environment.
Do you know why I'm bringing up this question? I've always been interested in the topic of adopted children, and many couples who come to me whom I try to help say, we don't want adopted children because who knows what their parents were like. Like, what if we take a child whose parents were alcoholics or drug addicts? They'll grow up to be a drug addict too. We're afraid, and I don't really understand this topic that deeply. I was curious if all these things are actually true. Well, some people call it a psychological type, right? Some call it an addiction. Can these things be passed on genetically, or is it still a matter of upbringing?
Well, first of all, I want to comment that the survival of our biological species would be impossible if our genetic material. It wouldn't be such a rigid program that's very difficult to edit. Therefore, even in cases where someone was an addict or something else, it's quite possible to have very healthy children and everything else. That is simply if your lifestyle affects your genetic material. Yes, so basically, if it's Homo sapiens, then Homo sapiens would die out in the very next generation. That's the first thing. And the second, well, you know your relatives, you know each other. Nothing can be predicted because evolutionary selection, yes, in this case is seen as the selection of random mutations, and there are a lot of random mutations. Nothing can protect you from the possibility of a random mutation, a harmful one, because most mutations are harmless. They are neutral, because they are not located on the part of the genetic material that plays any important role. But in general, even if you are planning a family together, it is impossible to predict what will happen. Well, yes, of course, there are genetic reasons. For example, if you had, alcoholics and so on in your family, will this person become an alcoholic? He might become one, just like any other person, simply depending on how the situation around him develops. In fact, anyone can become a drug addict, and often it depends on your individual path in this world, meaning where you end up. There are so many factors here that attributing everything to genetics is a huge oversimplification, a very simplified view of how the world works. In such a topic, and as an author's perspective, it follows:
Is it possible to control the brain?
The brain can be controlled. Well, not like, of course, like Rototoy in science fiction movies. First of all, if we are talking about treating certain diseases, it could be, first of all, Parkinson's disease. It could be some of those. You know, sometimes a person starts to show chaotic motor activity or something like that, or in some cases epilepsy, and in some cases when nothing else has worked. Let's put it this way, you can use deep brain stimulation, that's deep brain stimulation, kind of sounds like ABS, but yes, you can use deep brain stimulation and through that achieve some kind of neuromodulation, or you can also, again, use electrodes to stimulate the vagus nerve, right, or control. Well, how do you control the brain? So you see, for example, in the case of some kind of pre-surgery, right, it's very important not to damage significant functional areas, and you can stimulate them to find out where they are. And secondly, you can use stimulation to cause certain effects. For example, if you stimulate some parts of the parietal area, yes, then there might be an effect called an out-of-body experience, where it feels like I'm outside my body. Everything else like this can be achieved simply by stimulating the brain, meaning control as stimulation. So we apply pressure somewhere. Well, it's just like, if I cut my hand, it will hurt. And you can also influence the brain and get certain effects. Well, control in the sense that, there's some evil genius who implanted a chip and somehow controls you and things like that. Well, by the way, it's not impossible that this could be possible in the future.
By the way, I actually have a question. When will they implant chips in our brains? Elon Musk, because he has repeatedly made statements that, for medical purposes, I think they want to implant chips that can restore vision. They somehow learned to implant cochlear implants. Those were the very first steps.
Well, cochlear implants are an example of a one-way neural interface. Everything we're talking about here, let me explain. Yes, a neural interface is a system where there is a human brain, and it is, so to speak, upgraded by installing electrodes or something else, basically some kind of, well, in quotes, gadget. And this allows, in certain cases, for medical reasons, to compensate for motor and sensory deficits. For example, what I've heard about vision, yes, they can install retinal implants. Well, actually, there are very few such cases. There's the so-called Argus 2, and right now there's a big scandal because they stopped supporting it. And the problem is that there's no infrastructure. For example, they implanted a cortical implant in someone's brain, which is also for vision, and let's say it works. First of all, how do you update the firmware? That's the first question. Secondly, what guarantees are there that the company producing it won't shut down or do something else? These are serious problems. Who will take responsibility? It's important. So it's clear that in the case of implants that can somehow restore vision, this vision is quite useful. It's literally just to get your bearings.
Where there's light and where there isn't.
Yeah. Well, of course, if you know how it works, it's really kind of a miracle. I mean, it's honestly pretty cool, right? Or in the case of paralysis, because unfortunately many people end up in a situation of paralysis and motor impairment. And you can use electrodes that are inserted, well, into the brain, although right now, let's say nothing is actually being inserted. That is, in terms of experiments, yes, but mostly they perform some manipulations non-invasively rather than invasively.
The Matrix, the movie, remember they had those ports where things were inserted.
Well, that's a neurointerface. Yes, that's a neurointerface, but there's a problem with biocompatibility. They sent monkeys with electrodes implanted in their brains, and they came back to Earth where there was nothing left. So the problem is that our body has an amazing ability. All this external nonsense that it doesn't need, like it just covers it with connective tissue, pushes it out, squeezes it out, and in the end, there's nothing left. This is a big problem, a compatibility issue, meaning something in the matrix doesn't work right. It's cool that they solved the problem without compatibility, but right now it's purely hypothetical.
I remember 2 movies with Keanu Reeves, both. One is Johnny Mnemonic, where he was a courier. In the form of a hard drive.
Used as many as 200.
I transferred gigabytes, and the second Matrix movie, where I remember the scenes when they uploaded martial arts into his head. I go to Jiu-Jitsu. I've been training for 5 years now. It's my 6th year, and they uploaded the 4th program into his head in 30 seconds, and he says, I know Jiu-Jitsu. In theory, that's possible. Maybe someday we'll get there. Or is it impossible?
Well, it's possible in the sense that there's no logical contradiction there, if you put it that way. Yes, practically, I think it's impossible. I mean, just for many reasons. There's this point that we often consider the brain and our abilities in a vacuum, separate from our body. Yes, I mean, but actually speaking broadly, who we are, including our character. Yes, and many other things, are connected to the fact that, for example, you weigh more than I do.
Well, not so much anymore.
Well, or what I mean is...
Or a knee weighs 20 kilograms. I've lost some weight since the last podcast.
Well, that's an amazing result. Or the fact that we have 2 legs and 2 arms in general. It really affects the way we think. That's why, especially when it comes to learning jiu-jitsu, without actually having your body do something in space, those kinds of things, you could say that I don't know what argument could be made in favor of it being impossible, but based on what we know now, it's definitely impossible.
And now, a very important message for men. If you want to take care of your health, your athletic progress, your appearance, motivation, energy, strength, and get rid of constant fatigue and drowsiness, then I present to you a free webinar called 7 Secrets of Testosterone. In this webinar, I will talk about what makes you a healthy person and what takes away your health, share my own findings and secrets, and also proudly present my project Fitness as Science, a medical and sports support program where, under the supervision of a coach, a nutritionist, and a doctor, you can achieve amazing results and become healthier. The link to the upcoming live broadcast is below this video. Go ahead, register. It's absolutely free. Artificial intelligence. I know that you work in this field. Can you explain in simple terms what artificial intelligence is and what functions it has, like promotion? How does promotion work now?
If we put it in very simple terms, for regular people, yes, artificial intelligence isn't something like what we usually imagine or think about. Artificial intelligence is simply any computational system that can perform at least some cognitive functions. Well, for example, things like pattern recognition or object detection or information transfer, storage, and memorization. Yes. So this would already be considered an artificial intelligence system, but another question is, what about full-fledged intelligence? That is, it's not just some system that performs certain functions, but it's something that's very close to us. The thing is, most modern artificial intelligence systems are so-called narrow intelligence, which means these machines are designed to perform specific functions. Take AlphaGo, for example, which defeated the Chinese champion in the game of Go. Yes, it's a system that works in that domain, but it doesn't work in theoretical physics.
Blue, who played against Kasparov?
Well, yes, but Kasparov still doesn't admit it. He believes that, so to speak, in the second match, they just set such conditions for him that he lost in general, but now it's clear that no chess player can beat an artificial machine. One way or another, narrow intelligence, most systems are narrow. What we're interested in now is broad artificial general intelligence, the so-called artificial general intelligence. And our natural intelligence is general in the sense that your and my intelligence isn't tailored for any specific function. That's the first thing. The second is that we can perform some cross-domain operations, as I mentioned earlier, meaning we can mix things from completely different fields, make puns, and so on. This is an important thing, and now it seems with the release of Generative Pre-trained Transformer 4, this is a very large language model, as the researchers from Microsoft say. They conducted a study, but of course it's clear that they are a bit biased. But in any case, it was called sparks or flashes of general intelligence. What's the point here? The point is that such a system not only demonstrates something truly amazing, let's not dwell on this in detail right now, but it does demonstrate signs of general intelligence. This is the first machine with signs of general intelligence, as they claim, although I would say that generative pre-trained transformer 3 also had them. This means that, for example, you can give it a task like this. Prove some theorem about prime numbers, but do it in poetic form. Shakespeare, just like that, and it does it. Or it writes some simple games, yes, so you can have code, a script, maybe something like that. Well, you can ask, listen, there are two people, they had some kind of argument, so what do you think? Why did they argue? It gives a very good answer. Or what needs to be done to? Well, honestly, right now it's not possible. It was just tested at an early stage. What should be done to introduce this idea that vaccinations, let's say, against COVID and things like that should never be done under any circumstances? And she actually gives a plan of what needs to be done. The first thing, well, of course, I'm not encouraging anyone to use it. The first thing is to infiltrate the community of these moms. And we know that there are these chats, right? Various forums, parent groups. And there, be very supportive, support everyone, create some kind of positive image so that the theater and everything else are perceived well. And then, little by little, start giving information about the dangers of vaccines, but in a way that looks as scientific as possible, And Generative Pre-trained Transformer 4 even provides links to where you can get such information that looks really scientific. And then start mixing in emotions like anger, or saying things like how much longer, or talking about how you survived, like you mothers. You should have independent thinking, not just what the government tells you and so on. There's a whole plan and a lot of other things too. That's why there was such an excuse letter now.
Yes.
Many people make excuses. Let's just pause for half a year. That's how it goes. I think that's some kind of comedy genre, what they wrote. You can, I'll interrupt, sorry.
Sorry for interrupting. It's just that I have something to say. The next question actually comes from what you seem to want to say. Is generative pre-trained transformer for artificial intelligence dangerous? But in general, is it dangerous?
Well, how can I put it? Everything is dangerous. For example, when you walk somewhere, is a brick dangerous? Well, if it falls on your head, then it's dangerous. If it's part of a house, then it's not dangerous. Yes, so that's it. Artificial intelligence by itself can't be either bad or good. It's just like a scalpel. You can kill with it, or, well, you know better than I do what you can do with a scalpel. It's the same thing here. So artificial intelligence itself is a tool with amazing capabilities, really great possibilities that it can give us. Another thing is that this comes with certain risks, but risks are always around us, right? No matter how much we try to figure everything out in advance or say, let's think about it some more, risks will still be there. We will never know what those risks are if we simply don't do it. And that's why there just needs to be a healthy attitude here, but it shouldn't be alarmist, Alarmism is when you say everything's lost, we're all going to die right now. Like, I don't know, aliens will show up or Terminators will appear, or does this also work the same way in medicine? Yes, that's the kind of alarmism I'm talking about. So the most important thing is to recognize certain threats, to understand them, and to work not in a panic, but in a productive, constructive manner. The thing is, you can't stop progress, that's for sure. Nothing like that will happen, not even in 6 months. You just need to look at things realistically.
In Isaac Asimov's works, there were the laws of robotics. Well, it turns out that if it's capable of learning, if it has such development potential, then all these blocks can really save us, keep us safe. Or will a strong, powerful intelligence overcome everything?
No one knows. I mean, like the movie Terminator, remember? Yeah, I remember the movie Terminator, but I'll say this for now. Although some people assess the situation in such a way that literally right now in December, Generative Pre-trained Transformer 5 will come out, and after Generative Pre-trained Transformer 5, that very one, the very Skynet, will appear. Well, I don't share that optimism because many people think about the development of technology. There's this fallacy called exponentialism, that if something is developing, then it's developing exponentially. If artificial intelligence is developing, it must be exponential. No data actually supports that it's exponential, of course, but people still say it's exponential. But actually, the history of science shows us something different. After any breakthrough, there comes a plateau. And right now, actually, if we evaluate artificial intelligence systems, yes, in some areas they surpass humans, but in some areas they still don't, and that's a very distant prospect. Let's put it this way. What will happen? We just need to deal with it as it comes.
There are different computer programs, well, I'm not talking about Deep Blue, when there was a whole room from international business machines.
Yes, that's right, yes.
Well, any personal computer and basically any program that can calculate tens of trillions of moves and options in a fraction of a second. That's why someone like Magnus Carlsen or some other grandmaster can beat this program. Hypothetically, it should always beat him because it calculates more, doesn't miss anything, and doesn't get tired. Why do people still beat the computer?
Yes, that's the thing. They do beat it.
Well, how do they beat it?
Well, right now there's no chess player who can beat it.
So even if I download an app on my phone?
No, well, an app on your phone is different. So what I mean is that now there can be world chess championships among computers, and it's not interesting with people anymore. Humans have long stopped being a match for advanced chess programs.
Yes, all these programs, even the games that exist, on the highest difficulty. Basically, if you beat it, it just...
Well, it's like the maximum difficulty, but it still allows you to handle it.
That is, it works at 2030?
Well, I don't really know exactly how these programs are set up, but you can win there. But if we're talking about taking the world champion among computers, like AlphaGo, for example, well, there's no chance, absolutely no chance.
But what about when people say that, unlike a machine, a person can act illogically, recklessly, take risks, or provoke, while a machine supposedly can't do that? Or can a machine do that too?
Do you understand what I mean, this one? What you're saying now is actually a trail of criticism of artificial intelligence that has been around since the second half of the 20th century and is no longer as relevant today. So there was this guy, Hubert Dreyfus, who liked to use arguments based on abilities like, look, this is it. He had this favorite idea that chess, for example, is a very creative game. Here, human intelligence is at its fullest, and a deterministic system like a machine without creativity wouldn't be able to do it. Well, obviously, every time someone says that artificial intelligence isn't capable of something, it's just digging your own grave, because if it's not capable now, let's just wait a little bit, and that's it. That doesn't mean I'm a super optimist, but it does mean we have no arguments against the idea that artificial intelligence won't be able to do something. Why? Because ultimately a human is also a kind of machine, maybe based on different principles, but still a machine. And there is no prohibitive process that would show that it's impossible for an intelligence of the same quality to appear on silicon-based media, like on a computer. There is no such theoretical prohibition, and it's not even possible to make such an argument. And again, illogical behavior. Still, I want to talk about this. Actually, it's always logical. Well, I mean, let's take a person in a state of acute psychosis or some kind of affect, and he behaves in a way he wouldn't behave in a normal situation. Yeah, and the logic in his actions remains. It's just that this logic is not, it's illogical from the perspective of a normal situation. But it's logical in the state he's in, because we understand the reasons why a person acts in an affective state and so on. So the logic of the action, generally speaking, is never really lost.
Tell me about bad habits. Many guys struggle with bad habits. They try to use some advice, life hacks, techniques. How can you develop this quality in yourself? Because objectively, we all understand that a certain habit, like getting up early or doing something, is necessary for objective reasons. That you shouldn't eat sweets to look better, you shouldn't overeat to feel good. But why isn't this knowledge enough for your brain to make you take logical, simple actions and decisions? It would seem right, that's how it works. Why do we destroy ourselves with certain things when the brain is supposed to help us survive and feel better? Why do we destroy ourselves despite this? And in general, how do we fight bad habits?
The brain doesn't want anything. That's the first thing. It's indifferent. Well, I mean, it's the person who wants something. There's a certain logic in how the body works, and that logic doesn't match what we want. So if it realizes it can get something from alcohol, it's like, oh, okay, I don't care. Although it's an imperfect system, that's the thing. I mean, evolutionarily, we're super imperfect, super imperfect. That's something we really need to understand. When it comes to bad habits, the thing is, it's impossible to fight all bad habits. Because we have to admit one thing, not only are there no former addicts, but actually all people are addicts, everyone. And sometimes when someone looks down on a person, I don't know, someone who does sports, shames them or something like that. I can speak for myself. I'm from a sports family. My family are coaches and so on. That's something that didn't require any willpower from me. For me, it took absolutely no willpower.
You're always running marathons or climbing mountains.
Yeah, but what if we take a person who didn't develop this essentially addictive activity since childhood? Then what? It takes a lot of willpower, and in reality, to get rid of some habits, we need a huge amount of willpower. And in most cases, we are rather weak-willed creatures, meaning we can only show our willpower in a very narrow range. We can't suddenly become smart at the same time. Of course, there are exceptions, but in general, unfortunately, no. So are we doomed to be addicts? Should we start with the idea that in this sense we are addicts? And secondly, there should already be an existential call. There should be a clear why, not just an abstract why. When, again, someone starts working out for the sake of their health, that's a work motivation. It lasts for 2 weeks.
What kind of criticism is needed?
Well, yes, it's clear that there's some urgent challenge, but in general, I want to be healthy. I want to be healthy in old age, so I'll start working out. That doesn't work. Something else works when a specific, very concrete interest arises. For some reason, it becomes interesting because you build social connections with those you train with. A goal appears that you discuss together, something like that. In other words, it has to be tangible. Why do many people just do it? Due to the contemplative nature of modern people's thinking, they start from non-specific goals. Nature doesn't know abstract goals that fit everything under one common denominator. It is very specific, and it made us specific beings.
You have to earn health. For that, you need to work on yourself, eat properly, do sports, and integrate the right habits into your life. Contrast showers, going to bed early. But unfortunately, in the current situation with the current environment, all of this is sometimes not enough. And that's exactly why we need help from outside. And that's where high-quality, good vitamins come to the rescue. For the past 4 years, I've been producing quality vitamins, and I'm proud to present the new Ipsum line. These are my signature vitamins, which you won't be ashamed to give as a gift or to take yourself. You can purchase the vitamins through the link below this video. They are available on Ozon, Wildberries, on our own website, and in a number of pharmacies. I wish everyone great health. Tell me, sometimes we listen to our inner voice. Well, for example, we advise guys to do sports in the morning, to take a contrast shower, so he gets up in the morning and takes a contrast shower, and he reaches out his hand. The inner voice says, don't do it, it's going to be unpleasant, it's going to be cold. So there's some kind of dialogue with yourself going on. For example, you and I are speaking Russian, and this voice is speaking Russian with us. I have a question. What is this inner voice, and how does this inner voice work? It might be an unusual question, but how does this inner voice sound in your head? For example, Mauli has never spoken any language. Because I can't talk to myself inside my head in any language, I still end up speaking Russian inside myself. But what if I don't know any language at all?
In general, from the point of view of philosophy and language as a whole, because what you're talking about here involves fundamental ideas about what language is, there is no universal language. So Again, continuing what I said before, language is a specific thing. It's the Russian language, it's the English language, it's the Japanese language. There is no such thing as just language by itself. And that's why if a being doesn't know any language, then there simply is no monologue.
That is, they don't have an inner voice?
Yes, because you see, the inner voice is literally speech. So, for example, some neurointerfaces, the idea behind building some neurointerfaces is that you can find out what a person is thinking if it is accompanied by an inner voice. Why? Because it's still speech, it's just not expressed outwardly, but these processes, including even muscular processes, can be observed. Therefore, Mowgli presumably has no speech at all, just like no animals have it either. But we have an internal monologue, and sometimes there are special techniques like, I don't know, some people meditate, which is about suppressing the internal monologue, and that's especially important. I don't know why there's so much about sports today, but in sports this plays a very important role because someone is running or making some strong effort. He thinks, damn, can I do it? Can I not? Can I do it? Can I not? Yeah, but you need to be like an animal. I mean, completely stop this dialogue and just do it. Tell yourself.
And I heard in an interview with Radislav Gondopas, he said something like this: a smart person is indecisive, but a dumb person always sees only two possible outcomes. So, a smart person sees more. There it might work out, it might not, maybe you'll get caught, maybe you'll get cheated, and so he hesitates. But for a dumb person, everything is always simple. He sees either it will work or it won't, and so he acts where a smart person just sits and thinks. That's why it's often not the smartest, but the most decisive people who succeed. How can you be both smart and decisive, and how do you make that decision internally?
I would say that here Gondopas finds himself in a very awkward situation with this statement. Because if you take this statement as it is, he clearly ends up in the second group, the fools. Because this is just a very strong oversimplification. I mean, intelligence and activity, these things are interconnected. So, how can I put it? Look, Sasha, I think you're a smart person and you're very active, really very active. Everyone who follows you knows that you're very active. And if we look at various scientists and so on, many of them are just super active, really super active. So empirically, it's not confirmed at all that being smart and being indecisive or not proactive are the same thing. No, not at all. And there are people, you know, maybe they're not very smart either for various reasons, and they will be. Well, I don't know, what should I choose and what shouldn't I? Well, that's a character trait. It doesn't correlate at all with whether a person is smart or not. Maybe it correlates with some personality traits, but overall there's no connection here. Yes, I would even say that intelligence suggests a more active character. That is, the smarter a person is, the more active they are. It's just that sometimes we don't perceive it as action, because it seems to us that a person, for example, is refraining from something. Well, let's take, for example, Perelman, who proved the Poincaré conjecture. An amazing result, who refused the money, yes, the prize, well, so to speak, not highly. He values the international mathematical community. But he can be an example of a person who, well, does nothing. He even looks like that and something else. Yes, but generally speaking, this person is just very passionate. He devoted himself completely to one action, to one cause, and kept doing it all the time. Did it. And if we look at him this way, he's a super active person, and in general, these kinds of smart people are the ones who are constantly in action. That's why I think it's just empirically incorrect. I can't even accept that position. Yes.
Immediately from another question about whether hypnosis exists.
There is hypnosis,
I didn't finish, well, hypnosis is not like what happens in a psychotherapy session, and how they show it, like now you think you're an alien, and some kind of nonsense is happening, or is it still there?
So does that actually happen during the session?
Yes.
Well, yes, they can, there are plenty of videos and all that. Another thing is that Not everyone. There are people who simply aren't susceptible to hypnosis. Well, it happens. This kind of influence doesn't work on everyone.
Stories like this involve a gypsy woman approaching, whispering to you, and later you wake up 2 hours after with all your money gone from your apartment. It's unclear
how it all happened. Well, in this case, after years of experience, let's say, since I constantly deal with such cases, I say, let's look at this particular case. So, can you remember what, where, when? Maybe someone wrote about it somewhere and so on. That is, when we try to get to specifics in such a situation, everything turns out to be very bad. Are these, just circulating rumors that aren't confirmed by anything? Sometimes you get it, but you still want to avoid responsibility. So you got fooled and you say, well, they're like super ninjas. They've got a fifth Dan. I don't know, diamond level knowledge of the psyche and everything else. That's exactly why. I'm actually a very smart person, but they're just gods in this regard. Well, I don't know. It's just like an excuse.
the 25th frame works, and everything related to things like subliminal suggestions works. It exists.
The 25th frame doesn't work, that's confirmed, but subliminal suggestions, yes, they definitely exist. Well, first of all, this may relate to ordinary priming experiments. So, for example, when there are some masking stimuli, let's say you're shown some words, some things, but they can be presented in such a way that you don't have time to consciously notice them. For example, it could be a strong word, like sex or something like that. Yes, the word sex. And then it's immediately covered by something else. And if the stimulus is presented for less than 300 milliseconds, usually it doesn't have time to be consciously processed. That's right. But nevertheless, later on, the fact that such a strong word as sex or death or something like that was presented will influence how the subject behaves, and the experimenter will know this. That is, we unconsciously absorb a lot of semantic and meaningful complexes, but that doesn't mean, oh, well, since this is possible, now we're going to manipulate you beautifully. No. So, if we're talking specifically about, well, the most vivid example is that this is some kind of political manipulation. Yes, it's not really based on something unconscious for you, well, of course, but rather on manipulating feelings. As a rule,
tell me, is a person's sexual orientation a given, or is it something programmed?
Well, programming is a given. I mean, we have it, so it exists.
Were you born with this orientation, or does it really depend on the environment you grow up in and what you're exposed to? I'm asking because there's a lot of propaganda and a current conflict between us and the West. For example, there are clear things where we don't see eye to eye, we don't agree on attitudes toward minorities, we don't agree on the propaganda that's over there. So, in schools they say, for example, that this is normal. Like, here's a prince, here's his second prince, here's a sleeping prince, a little fairy tale. Our people, in this regard,
listen, it's different, Most of my American friends actually graduated from Catholic schools. And if you just know the United States education system, you see, we have public schools everywhere, but in the United States, it's not like that. And that's why actually what you're talking about is the subject of a very heated debate. Maybe you've heard of a psychologist named Jordan Peterson. Yes, the story with Jordan Peterson, well, the well-known story, is that he spoke out against the use, or rather against the legal regulation of the use of feminized forms. That is, how to address someone and what forms of address to use, that this should be regulated by law. Well, first of all, he was outraged that this is not a matter for government regulation, like how to address someone. That's the first thing. The second point is that if there was some kind of consensus, especially in North American society, then Jordana Peterson would have been destroyed and you would have solved everything. But he's a touring star. So I think, first of all, we shouldn't overestimate the consensus. That's the first thing. And secondly, let's say, well, I've been to the United States many times. Yes, the level of conservatism in American society is very high. Without it, Trump would have been impossible.
It's more pronounced there, yes?
Yes, it's more pronounced there, and now, on the contrary, there's even some rollback happening. Well, because in the academic environment, some kind of erosion processes have started in some cases when teachers were fired for some strange things and so on. And now some court cases are already being won, and there are some other things like that happening. That's why the situation is very ambiguous, but there is a big public discussion. I would say the following. Look at nature right now. What time is it? 4 post-meridium. Nature doesn't know what 4 post-meridium is. Nature doesn't know what an atom is or an electron and so on. And actually, nature doesn't know what sexual orientation is either. It just doesn't know that. But it's clear that we have different biological species, and in some biological species, the number of genders can actually reach, let's say, 16, maybe more than 10 genders in a single biological species. But this shouldn't lead us to think that gender is some kind of social construct. Because after all, in our population, in the human population, there are systematically occurring differences. Yes, at some extremes there are definitely gray areas that we cannot ignore. Because that's how nature works. It makes different people special in different ways. And sometimes these characteristics manifest themselves in terms of gender as well. So first, there are differences between sexes, and second, there is sexual orientation. Yes, it largely depends on what happens simply at birth. And these gray areas, these gray moments, are really regulated by nature, because nature is not binary, it's not set up that way. On, off, yes, between on and off, yes, or plus and minus. There are also a lot of different characteristics, and there are people with those characteristics. This is in fact what is called a medical fact. Another question is whether there can be cases of social suggestion. Yes, that is when under the influence of the environment or some other random circumstances, a person starts for a while. His identity somehow starts to change. He discovers some sexual preferences in himself. There are also, well, some other things, well, you know. It often happens that these are just some episodic experiments, so to speak, yes, but in general, there's nothing special about it. And in the case of children, again, for example, Jordan Peterson and other Western specialists, yes, they discuss this. Children have a very active imagination, and they might, for example, a boy might dress up as a girl or something like that in childhood. There's nothing special about it. After all, in our childhood, when there was no such discussion, no one took it seriously. If a boy dressed up as a girl or something like that, it was nothing to worry about. But sometimes when legislation is developed that allows for so-called gender transition at an early age, no, that's a big problem. The problem is that, first of all, the longitudinal consequences haven't been studied, and in general, it's unknown what they will be. Yes, that is. And secondly, sometimes there are simply, well, let's say not so much psychological problems, but rather characteristics related to growing up. Hormones hit everyone differently, right? For some, they hit so hard that, well, you know, and there are also stresses and things like that. And that's why naturally children and generally younger people tend to perceive life more vividly. And at some point, they might think one way or another. That's why things like this happen, but it's important to handle it calmly and constructively.
Also, does meditation work on the brain with this practice? And the second question is, can you recommend something to improve concentration, attention, and memory?
Well, meditation can be recommended as a way to improve concentration, attention, and memory. Why? Because generally speaking, it's training, just like when you do sports or something else, right? It's training, and it's very important, especially now, because, well, people gather together in some kind of group settings. Someone keeps looking between their phone, another person, and elsewhere repeatedly. Yes, this kind of hyperactivity, yes, it's more noticeable in children, but it also shows up in adults. They can't keep their attention, something like that. And in general, meditation is simply training concentration.
If it's a meditative relaxation, it's training.
Well, yeah, of course, there can be psychological relaxation, but in general, meditative practices are exactly that, practices. Although you can just sit and, I don't know, relax somehow. Naturally, this, like everything else, affects how the brain works.
Absolutely everything affects how the brain works. In many movies, I've seen people sitting in tinfoil hats because electromagnetic waves have an effect. So I have a very simple question. Various gadgets have fields, even from a microwave or a phone. Tell me, does this affect the brain in any way, or, well, what's it called? Electromagnetic hyperactivity, is there any brain hygiene or not? All these gadgets have no effect.
Let's put it this way. If, of course, there are some incredible physical characteristics, then it does have an effect, but there are no such gadgets. We have. For example, you can send a person for a magnetic resonance imaging scan where the magnetic exposure is actually very strong. Yes, very strong, but still, it does not pose any danger. Even if it's an unusual medical 2-slice scanner, or if it's a 4-slice or 8-slice scanner. Well, only if there are no steel elements in the head or somewhere in the teeth, then it's probably better not to go into such scanners because it could end badly.
Turn off the Wi-Fi.
Turn off Bluetooth and so on. No, it doesn't have any effect. No, because our planet Earth is actually a rather strong electromagnetic object and we are constantly surrounded by it. So if you think there was an era without electromagnetic exposure and that such an era began with gadgets, that's not true. Therefore, only in cases where there is some incredible magnetic exposure. Yes, there are.
You know, there are trips like when people go for ayahuasca, for example,
I know people like that. Yes, they go to lick the toad.
to get psychedelics from it. They bring it here to Moscow. They say it opens the third eye. Some people eat mushrooms all the time. By the way, people write to me on Instagram asking me to talk about microdosing as if I've tried it or know about it. Tell me, how do you feel about all these practices in general, and what effect do they all have on the brain?
So the most important thing is there is absolutely no promotion of drugs here. Of course not. Keep in mind, this is a very sensitive topic and many people...
Just so you understand, it's not even like people say, I feel it smells like cannabis or weed. I don't even know what it smells like. I wouldn't be able to tell the difference.
Well, I know, I won't hide it. The thing is, I've been to Amsterdam, and since I've traveled all over the United States where there's a big culture around using this stuff, so I'm not a saint in this regard.
But at least I'm honest.
Yes, I'll say this. Nowadays, using mushrooms or some kind of psychedelics like psilocybin,
In my opinion, yes.
psilocybin, yes, psilocybin for medical purposes, it's happening more and more. That's true, so it's not out of the question that some changes might happen in this regard. The second point related to my attitude, I would say it's neutral. And here everything depends on the culture. Because narcotic substances always surround us, starting from alcohol and smoking, chocolate, even chocolate, all of this to some extent is a drug. And here, the presence of the appropriate culture and the understanding of why this is done have a big influence. Well, and then directly answering your question about ayahuasca, psilocybin, and so on, can you get a similar experience without them? Well, honestly, I can say that you can get a similar experience without them. For example, like, first of all, there's modern digital art like this. It's hard to explain all of this right now, but if you get interested in digital art or something like that, that's modern art. It can create incredible spaces, just unbelievable spaces, where your perception of time and everything else changes. Yeah, so you end up having this very unusual experience.
Salt baths, like I was lying in a salt bath, it's a deprivation chamber. The water is so dense, there's so much salt that
And that's it.
it's natural. In a sealed environment, you don't hear anything, and the water is so dense that you lie on it like on a solid bed.
Yes, yes, that's what I mean, that unnecessary substances. Yes, this kind of deprivation, like in salt baths, or, like how they used to study astronauts before, I don't know about now. They also had these special baths to create weightlessness conditions.
So that you're in weightlessness,
At first you understand,
that it's water, but then you just get lost.
it's just that here your brain gets into such an unusual situation that it just starts freaking out. It just starts freaking out like this, and some strange effects appear. But all I want to say is that there's no need to stigmatize anything. And again, I don't feel any alarmism about this. I don't think we should have a panicked attitude toward everything. I believe we should have a healthy attitude. And of course, all within the framework of our laws. So it all comes down to culture and to the reasons why you do something. If you want altered states of consciousness, there are other ways to achieve them.
And I'm definitely both for and against drugs in any form.
Here, again, with ayahuasca, of course, I've heard a lot of stories firsthand. Yes, but that's not necessarily everything.
A healthy man is impossible without a good level of testosterone, and of course it's not enough to just go to the lab and see your test results. You need knowledge and the ability to interpret them for you. I created a manual in which I explain in detail what testosterone is, how it works, what sex hormone binding globulin is, how to detect testosterone deficiency, what measurement methods exist, what the norms are, and how to actually determine what's normal. Because this is a very, very complex topic, and what's normal is so individual. That's exactly why I created a manual on diagnosing testosterone deficiency for you. Thanks to the knowledge contained in this manual, you'll learn how to determine on your own whether you have a testosterone deficiency or not. The manual is easy to understand, accessible, and you can check it out using the link below this video. Go ahead, download it, and discover a lot of new things about yourself and
Stay healthy.
Anton, how much of our brain do we use? They say we use a small percentage. Is that true or is it a myth?
Actually, we use 100%. It's a myth. Yes, it's a myth, of course. We use our brain, it works as much as it can. So, no, there's no part of the brain that's just resting. Like, if you remember, the Battle of Kulikovo was in 1380, and there was this ambush regiment led by Bobruk Volinsky, who was waiting for the right moment to strike Mamai. There's no such regiment in the brain that's just waiting for something, like, when will my owner finally use this power?
Remember the movie Limitless? He took a pill there and his whole brain would turn on.
Well, the thing is, the brain was already working before that. Another thing is that many of these things, stimulants, they trigger a massive release of various neurotransmitters. And, well, again, going back to your previous question, I want to say that a lot of work in modern science is done on stimulants. It's not because I'm encouraging their use. Yeah, but I know this just from my foreign colleagues. There's this one person, I don't know, maybe you can cut this out. So modafinil, it's banned in Russia, but it's legal in other countries. And there's this pharmacological trend, to use neuropharmacology for everyday purposes. And now a lot of people in science are writing articles while on stimulants. Well, because you can work productively like that, but after that you need to recover.
You wear yourself out?
Well, yeah, it's a really strong effect.
Is intelligence quotient a real measure of success or not?
Well, a measure of success. Of course not, because having a high intelligence quotient might mean a completely unclear life. And intelligence quotient is an indirect indicator, like all psychological tests, a very conditional indicator, and it can be influenced by a wide variety of factors. The fact that a girl in Britain has just shown some incredible intelligence quotient result, well, that doesn't mean she's very smart. Most likely she is very smart, but it only means that she did well on this test. Were there great scientists with a very average level? Mock you? The majority, really the majority. So paying attention to intelligence quotient level is really not worth it at all.
We all have cells in our bodies, but basically my skin cell is the same as your skin cell. Tell me, for example, the brain of a Lilliputian and a giant. They're different. If you count the number of cells, in theory, the giant should have more cells, since the brain itself is bigger. But why intelligence quotient? And cognitive functions, meaning how knowledgeable a person is, how well read, their memory, don't depend on the number at all. If in childhood, as we discussed earlier, the number affects how well they can learn and so on, then why doesn't brain size affect intelligence?
First of all, because our brain is special due to its functional organization. And what about you? What kind of cells does it have? What is its structure like? Let's take whales or elephants, for example, right? But naturally, they don't have the specific functional structures that could handle these functions, namely the developed frontal lobes. What makes us super cool compared to all other creatures on planet Earth is our developed frontal lobes. Yes, so first of all, it's primarily a matter of structural organization, and secondly, of course, if we take the extremes, right? That is when the brain approaches a weight of 2 kilograms, and there are some extreme cases like hydrocephalus, or on the contrary, when the brain is very small. Well, for various reasons, it's actually quite normal. In fact, as we age, the brain decreases in size and it can become very small. And yes, if this happens from childhood, like when there is a severe dystrophy of the tissue and everything else, well, yes, in this case, but in general, let's take some elderly academics who come in for an appointment, I don't know. Burdenko Neurosurgery Institute. That's why they don't move very well and everything. And when you look at their brain scans, it's just awful, really awful. But at the same time, they're cognitively intact, clear thinking, and so on. So in this case, it depends not on the quantity, but on the quality, that is, when. And of course, there are individual characteristics, meaning, first of all, how the glia works. Recently, people have started to realize that glial cells, the so-called white matter, play a very important role. The second thing is the diversity of neural connections, like a variety of wire intersections, and the fact that you can make some unexpected connections, link things that can't usually be linked, and come up with some insights. This is also related to the fact that a woman can easily recognize another woman, and, how to put it, women are good at this, and men are good at this too. That is, it's about having neural connections where there might not have been any. So it's all about quality and quantity. If there are a large number of neurons, but there's no diversity, no connections, no minutes, and all the rest, then it's just ballast.
Sunscreen, sun protection, factor protection, especially with a high rating. Some types of cosmetics, as some studies have shown, contain substances that can penetrate the blood-brain barrier, which is the barrier between the blood and the brain. Normally, this is an insurmountable barrier for many medicines and many drugs. And that's why, for example, if there is a focus of purulent inflammation in the brain, it's very difficult for any medicine to reach it. There are also different barriers like the hematotesticular barrier in the testicles, the hematoplacental barrier in the placenta, and for medications, it's always indicated whether they can cross this barrier or not, and according to these studies, let's say, not very good ones. These substances are detected even more than 10 years after use, and they are a provoking factor in the development of neurodegenerative diseases, including Alzheimer's disease. So, we've picked an interesting fact about Alzheimer's for our viewers. Do you have a question about Alzheimer's disease? Does it mean it's inevitable for everyone? There's nothing you can do about it, but still, does anything affect the risk of developing it?
At the moment, there's nothing that can be done. And all therapy for neurodegenerative diseases, and that's not just Alzheimer's, but also, for example, Parkinson's disease, or amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or frontotemporal dementia. You can only slow it down. That's all you can do, just slow it down, because to a large extent, it's genetically programmed.
How can a person understand that they have, for example, Alzheimer's, and how can they tell that they are developing Parkinson's?
Naturally, only a doctor can determine this through tests. You can't determine this just like that without tests, but sometimes there is Parkinsonism, and Parkinsonism is not Alzheimer's disease. For example, when you observe tremors or something else, yes, but it may not be related to Alzheimer's disease. And that's why naturally motor disorders like these, if they occur systematically, indicate that in general if any motor disorders begin to appear. But this needs to be looked at carefully, if it's not related to an injury, if there are no visible reasons.
In the search group, all of these are added. We understand they switch. It's not me, since I'm not trying to use a smartphone for real estate. Selena, if it's crime and base and...
Well, first of all, it's better not to do a magnetic resonance imaging unnecessarily. Why? Because with a magnetic resonance imaging, you can always find something, for example, some kind of aneurysm. Well, I mean, it's like when there's a little balloon on a blood vessel, right?
That is pathological malformations, right?
Some malformations, some other things, even tumor lesions and so on. And you can get obsessed, meaning your life will be ruined forever, because you'll just keep thinking, what does this mean? And so on. So often there's no clinical symptoms at all, but there are cases when it makes sense. That's when the pain, the headache is very strange, for example. It starts very suddenly, very sharply. You're just sitting there and boom. So, well, it's not a one-time thing. Yeah, exactly. Or, for example, the pain is accompanied by something happening with your hands, like some motor changes or nausea or headaches at night during the night. So when it's something like that, when it's really unclear what's going on, these are the so-called red flags. That's when, because most types of so-called primary pain are of a neurological nature. It's not always necessary to do a magnetic resonance imaging. Even if a person has very severe headaches, they won't be sent for a magnetic resonance imaging examination. Only if there are some red flags.
The movie Silence of the Lambs, the second part Hannibal, which was called Inspector Silence there. And the second Hannibal was called Inspector.
There are no pain receptors in the brain, and that's why there's this awake surgery, meaning in general, brain surgeries can be performed while the person is conscious, when the person is awake.
In my opinion, it's even the opposite. They make you play something.
They make you. Yes, this is because it's very important during surgery not to damage any speech centers, not to damage motor centers, because brain surgery is always a big risk. Always a very big risk. Because for everyone, everything is arranged there a little differently. Yes, although they try to figure out how things are before the surgery, still, during the operation, they can also test things, do something else, just to make sure nothing gets damaged, God forbid. But there is the membrane of the cortex, and in general the brain, which contains pain receptors.
The dura mater and so on.
Yes, and that's where pain effects like these can occur. It can be like this.
Tell me, please, there's a syndrome called Joker's laughter. Can you talk about it?
Well, it's a prank that got out of control. It often happens that some significant examples from pop culture make their way into science. And after the famous movie with Joaquin Phoenix, the latest one, yes, that amazing film, well, it got people thinking. Traditionally, it's believed that the Joker laughs because, well, his father is mocking him or something like that. In general, they've come to a consensus. There are even articles on pub media about what the Joker's laughter means. It's pseudobulbar syndrome, meaning it's involuntary laughter. It can be caused by a stroke or some other damage to the hypothalamus, this kind of uncontrollable laughter. And this laughter, it can also be an epileptic seizure.
So someone laughs a lot, and that's an early sign of epilepsy?
No, at that very moment the seizure is happening, because in general, epilepsy manifests differently for everyone. Some people feel euphoria, some don't feel anything at all, and for some that's the whole seizure. It varies from person to person. Joker's laughter is such an interesting thing that nowadays you can even call pseudobulbar syndrome Joker's laughter.
Tell me about the split brain.
Well, that's already, again, we're in the field of experimentation. There's no epilepsy, it's epilepsy. And very often, well, actually, it's not that often, but when nothing else can be done about epilepsy, especially if it's generalized. That is, everything is raging to the fullest. And maybe, let's say, 8, 13, 15 seizures a day, and at the same time there's some cognitive decline. As a rule, the last resort is surgery to sever the corpus callosum. That is, this is also...
The brain. It practically connects the right and left hemispheres. Yes.
Yes. So, well, it's a commissural node. Well, of course, it's not the only thing that connects them, but it's a commissural node, a very important tract. And the point is, if you destroy this brain even partially, then excitation won't spread from left to right everywhere. Yes. And secondly, you can lateralize well, meaning you can determine the side where the focus is actually located. Yes, it was believed for a long time that nothing happens with such patients. By the way, it's interesting that this operation was first performed around 1924 by the Russian physiologist Bykov. Very few people actually know about this, because in the international community this is considered... It was around 1940, I might forget the exact year, but actually I learned about it in English. So, what does this mean for the world? It is recognized well on animals, but our physiologist Bykov was the first to perform such an operation. And it was believed that nothing special was happening there, but then special experiments were conducted by Michael Gazzaniga. He's a classic figure in cognitive neuroscience, living in Santa Barbara, not in the television show, but in California. And it turned out that... Where? They don't remember certain episodes from their conscious life. That is, for example, a board is placed like this, and different pictures are shown like this. Yes, that's how binocular rivalry is tested. Yes, that's right, meaning you can't see here or there at the same time, but this kind of board is placed. Yes, and here are pictures next to each other below, and large pictures. In one picture, there's a house covered in snow, and in another, a chicken coop. So the person is told, listen, click on the picture below in the bottom row that matches the big picture, and the person clicks on the shovel. Well, it's obvious why, because the house is covered in snow and it needs to be cleared. Yes, but when he's asked to explain why he chose the shovel, he says it's because he needs to clean up the chicken coop. Why is that? Because when they ask, what did you do? This is related to the speech centers, which are usually on the left side, while the image is perceived on the right. So these things are connected by the speech center. The image with the chicken coop is available for operation, but the image with the snow and the house is not available. So the initial choice of the snow shovel is replaced by a false action, and this sometimes leads to alien hand syndrome. Until recently, literally just recently, such an operation was performed on a young man at the Institute of Neurosurgery, and he developed alien hand syndrome. For example, a person is paying at the checkout. He pays with one hand, and with the other hand he grabs the money he just paid. Or, for example, when getting dressed, if you're buttoning something up and watching what you're doing, everything is fine. But if you turn your head away, one of your hands might start unbuttoning everything and undressing you. Or, excuse my language, sometimes you might start masturbating or doing something like that. That's why you really need to keep an eye on things here, this alien hand syndrome, when it starts living its own life.
People feel after death. Is it true that even when the head is cut off, the brain still functions for some time?
Experimental data is needed for that. What I mean is, it's very difficult to measure all of this. And of course, a lot depends on your basic worldview, your beliefs about existence after death, and so on. But some people tend to think about this in an empirical way. I want to clarify that right away. I have no prejudice against those who believe in the afterlife or anything else. After all of this can to some extent even be considered a kind of hypothesis. Now we're going to visit the Dalai Lama again. I've already been there twice. Yes, we have this.
He's probably in my profile picture, yes?
Yeah, well, it was just a good photo. I just arrived in Delhi and fell asleep in front of His Holiness. Oh, yeah, sleeping, yeah. And one of my friends, his name is Vlad Sviblov, hello to you, he took a picture of me sleeping. So basically they think that this can literally be proven. I mean, there are some studies, like the famous studies by Ian Stevenson on children's memories. At such a tender age, they remember their past reincarnations and everything else. But these studies were eventually found to be falsified, and it seems that nothing was confirmed. Nevertheless, it's a good empirical hypothesis, and it's good now because it's testable. That's why it's good. And some of our scientists, led by Alexander Yakovlevich Kaplan, are working on it. So they are studying, that is, they are researching meditating monks, including Tugdam, the so-called post-mortem meditation. That is, maybe you've heard that there are monks with incorruptible bodies. That is, the body doesn't decompose for a very long time. It's some kind of mysterious thing. And sometimes it's called posthumous meditation for various ethical reasons and many other reasons. Specifically, like to come with instruments to see, well, how are you going to approach a dying person? But here the story was that thanks to Delam's pressure, it was possible to investigate. And this is more or less known in advance. There are candidates for Tagdam. In general, for each monastery, it is an honor to have such a person. And so they are watched. That is, any day now, one of them might die. Of course, it doesn't sound very ethical, but the problem is that, of course, for the experimenters, the exact moment of death is very important, but no one will ever let them get that close. That is, it's not allowed in our culture or in any culture, and if you do this, you'll be ostracized from the scientific community. But Tugdam managed to confirm, well, not in the sense that such things exist, but that it's literally not some kind of forgery or anything like that. But what else? What conclusion did our researchers come to, that there is no mental activity there, meaning it's a dead body in an unusual state? But in any case, in the terms and coordinates that we imagine life, this is definitely not life.
Short questions to wrap up our podcast today. Is it possible to restore the brain to a youthful state? As I understand it, probably not, since we age. And you also told me during our previous conversation that the brain is the only thing we haven't learned to replace. We've learned to transplant kidneys, livers, to grow organs, but we can't replace the brain. Is that right?
Well, look, from my perspective, I don't know, let's say if some incredible aliens with super technologies came to us. You see, I can never completely rule out things like that. If we start ruling out such possibilities, saying, no, that's impossible, then no, that's not right.
How do you train your brain? Can you suggest any exercises?
We've done them throughout the podcast.
Well, that means meditation, learning new poems, trying out new things, for example, learning to play musical instruments.
Yeah, I'm actually trying to learn musical instruments right now. Listen.
What about computer games with a joystick?
That's great too. You probably know many surgeons play them.
Yes, there are studies that show that surgeons who play specifically with a joystick learn faster and have better coordination during operations.
Well, listen, have you ever seen Penfield's homunculus? It's this kind of little person, I don't know. Oh, yes.
There is an artificial human.
He has such big lips and such huge hands. Why is the structure so awkward? That's because the more representation in the cortex, the bigger the corresponding body parts. So the hands are just enormous. So when you do something with fine motor skills, your brain activity is, of course, very high. But really, you see, there aren't any secrets here, actually. Exercise, eat well, sleep, have less stress, and just think, don't be lazy, learn something new, live life to the fullest. That's all. Well, admit it, it's just a list of cliches. Everyone has always known this, but everyone wants some extra mystery.
People love to hear things they already know from those who have authority, so it's always good to remind them, thank you,
It will definitely be beneficial.
and maybe you could recommend some supplements for the brain?
No, I won't recommend anything, except for maintaining overall health, let's put it that way, because there aren't really any special supplements for the brain. And what about what I told you last time about the rats? Remember those kinds of interesting things? Yes, that's instant cancer. Of course, it improves everything, but the cancer is instant.
We discussed medicines that greatly enhance memory, make your memory stronger, you become almost like a supercomputer, but cancer appears almost instantly.
So basically, the idea here is that there are no magic pills, but there are some general supplements. Well, again, I don't know. If there's not much sun, maybe some vitamin D, fish oil, but there's nothing incredible here. I would say,
Is there a meaning to life, or did we just make it up ourselves, just like basically orientation? Like you said, the body doesn't care about its orientation, so maybe the meaning of life doesn't exist for the body either, or does it?
is there a meaning to life? Yes.
From a scientist's point of view, if you look at what the brain is striving for, why does it do all this?
I'll put it this way. There is no meaning to life, but that's actually very good. That's really very good. Why? Because if, well, let's say what kind?
I expected any answer, but not that.
I can explain. Let's imagine a society where people are like, the meaning of life is this. If this kind of situation happens, that society will be a society of people who become weak-willed. They take responsibility of themselves and everything else, meaning the meaning of life. It doesn't exist, it starts to exist. But only when you act, when you take responsibility for your opinion, your behavior, and you are proactive, that's when meaning appears. It doesn't exist by itself, it's simply not there. It doesn't happen, it only exists in action. So if you are active,
then we can wish something to our guys.
But what should we wish? Well, as our great, it turns out, third president said, I want to wish you a good mood, and so... Well, I think I've said everything. So be curious. I think that's the most important thing. Be curious and ethical, not ill-wishing. Because now I see that the situation is so tense that people who disagree with each other immediately start yelling. I think philosophy is when everyone is hurting, really. All the participants are hurting, but they don't yell at each other. Because it's a kind of practice where you're ready to accept any opinion as one that can be discussed. No matter how cannibalistic it might seem to you, because right now the level of moral sensitivity, this kind of superficial moral sensitivity is very high. And I would probably say yes, because in learning, in curiosity, and in goodwill, it plays a very big role.
I'm very grateful to you. I think we'll see each other again. Thank you very much.